Hi and welcome back to Hegel on the beach. Now today, as you can see, this is not the beach. We're in rural England. We're actually in Liverpool. We're on the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. This is the Bootle end, but it's so lovely here. Look at that. So amazing that I couldn't not come here on a day, and it was a bit windy at the beach. So anyway, in this gorgeous, see the weeping willows and everything. You wouldn't think, like, to turn the camera around, you're in the middle of Bootle, would you? So anyway, master slave. Last time we were talking about desire and about something Hegel calls self-certainty. And we achieve the certainty, if you remember, through our desires, but beyond satisfying our basic needs such as eating and drinking and so on. We talked about Hegel saying in paragraph 175 that self-consciousness attained is satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. And we talked about a developmental model of the human psyche that goes alongside the historical model of development. And this next part of phenomenology is really important. And this is the master slave, as I said. And it seems to go without saying that Karl Marx he must have been massively influenced, but if he didn't use it, he was massively influenced by this section of the book. Even the words master slave can't be really spoken without an acknowledgement of Marx's thought, and there's also his conception of bourgeois and proletariat. And we'll talk about Marx obviously throughout this, but of much more interest are sort of those who came after Marx and their interpretations, and their spin they put on Hegel as well. So one person in particular I want to talk about is the guy I mentioned in the last video, Alexander Kojève. The philosopher, the one who wrote the letter to Stalin and who said, I want to be your guru because, you know, we can work together to recreate the world. And he compared himself to Hegel as well, if you remember. Very modest guy. And he wanted to believe that Stalin could only really understand his own role if Kojève told him what his role was. But I want to talk about Kojève because he thought that master and slave was the most important part of phenomenology. That's what he based he did a series of lectures in the 30s. Writing the letter to Stalin, you know, alone, I mean, it does, and also the fact that he was a Soviet agent, that might make him like the biggest, you know, a knob of transcendental proportions in anyone's eyes. Okay, but his reading of Master Slave is extremely influential, and it's really good as well. Lots of it is very good. So we do need to talk about Kojève because when we talk about our understanding of what this next section is about, master and slave, we've got to look, Kojève's influence is massive and you can't go around it, you can't go under it, you've got to go through it. So we'll do that a bit later, but before we do, we'll have a look at Hegel himself and where he was getting his ideas from and his inspiration in this section, okay? So I think master slave now in its historical context as the sun comes out to ruin this shot. Okay, so why was this section written like this? So Hegel seems to have had one eye on the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, political philosopher, and he wrote the book Leviathan during or just around the time of the English Civil War with the chaos and, you know, bloodshed and so on. And if you pick up a copy of Hobbes's book, the front cover probably has a picture of the original frontispiece, which is like a diagram at the very beginning of the book. I was going to bring it out today, but I forgot. And Hobbes helped design it. And it's a picture of like a terrifying giant king like this, with his arms outstretched. And above him is a quote from the book of Job, which says, I'm going to use a bit of Latin, non est potestas super terram quae comparator, which is, in the English, there is no power on earth to be compared to him. The king standing there like that, okay? So Leviathan, I think it's to do with the reason why he's chosen. The sea monsters were symbols of tremendous power, and they were hugely feared in early modern times, you know, with the success of like travelers' tales and sailors coming back from far-flung lands and so on like that, and these fables, and also obviously Hobbes being familiar with the Bible. So Hobbes says that Leviathan is a commonwealth or a state which is but an artificial man, though of greater stature and strength than the natural for whose protection and defence it was intended. So for Hobbes, the state is a necessary evil. It's a Leviathan, it's a terrifying monster or an institution to protect its citizens, which is a scary concept. And the picture itself is very scary. In Leviathan, Hobbes says that the condition of mere nature, that is to say, absolute liberty, such as is theirs, and neither are sovereigns nor subjects, is anarchy and the condition of war. To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, they have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. So Hobbes thinks that where there is no society, there's no government, there's no law, there's no justice. Individuals take whatever they can by individuals. The strong beat the weak. And desire, therefore, it's important for Hobbes, because desire is, I'm going to take what I want, but it's got to be kept in check. So that's why you've got this big king figure. And Hegel's starting point in Master-Slave is frustrated and realised desire. It's two desires going head to head in a death struggle, and it's just a bit like, it's like Hobbes describes it. So Hobbes says this. He says, and because the condition of man, as hath been declared in the precedent chapter, is a condition of war of every one against every one, in which case every one is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be a help unto him in preserving his life against his enemies. It followeth that in such a condition every man has a right to do everything, even to one another's body, and therefore as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever be in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war of every man against every man. So humankind without the state is a terrifying prospect, according to Hobbes. That's the message, isn't it? So Hegel, right, that's the Hobbes bit, and he had his other iron on Rousseau. And his second discourse, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, okay, Rousseau's second discourse. So, Rousseau takes the opposite view, bluntly, to Hobbes. And the story behind Rousseau's second discourse, just as a brief aside, is, it's a nice sunny day, is that there was an official in the French state somewhere, or an aristocrat or something, and he set an essay question for all comers. And I think there was even some money attached to this essay question. And the question set was, what is the origin of inequality? Blah, blah, natural law. So it's about what's the equality. And Rousseau wrote this brilliant essay, which I'm going to quote from, in response to it. But he didn't actually win the prize, I don't think. So there's hope for us losers yet. So in the second discourse, Rousseau attacks Hobbes' Leviathan idea. He says this: above all, let us not conclude with Hobbes that because man has no idea of goodness, he must be naturally wicked, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue. Hobbes had clearly seen the defects of all modern definitions of natural right, but the consequences which he deduces are equally false. He ought to have said that the state of nature, being that in which the care for our own preservation is the least prejudicial to that of others, was consequently the best calculated to promote peace and the most suitable for mankind. He does say the exact opposite in consequence of having improperly admitted, as part of a savage man's care for self-preservation, the gratification of a multitude of passions, which are the work of society and have made laws necessary. So Rousseau says that people are neither good nor bad, but rather that we're born as a blank slate and we become socialised. It's society and the environment which influences the way that we learn and who we are and who we become. We aren't born bad or with original sin. In Rousseau's state of nature, because there's no society-generated pathologies, and this initial primitive state, it doesn't have serious types of conflicts, and the types of conflicts that Hobbes witnessed in the English Civil War. Modern society, therefore, is to blame for the disorder and for breaking up the original state of nature, which Rousseau sees as, I'm going to fall into this canal, aren't I, in a minute, right? So, which Rousseau sees this state of nature as the true realm of freedom. So he says, nothing is so gentle as man in his primitive state, when placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the fatal enlightenment of civil man. So that's Rousseau. You've got Hobbes, and you've got Rousseau. So Hegel's read all this stuff, by the way, about the origin of humankind, and in fact, about the origin of reason itself, because that's what Hegel's story is about, the origin, this part of the story, the origin of reason. But he's going to give his own account of socialisation, society and reason. But I want you to see how Hobbes and Rousseau form part of the backdrop to the master-slave. Hegel is, in this part of the book, he's going to look at the origins of civilization, as I said, and he's referring to an historical state of affairs that must have existed in master and slave, the genesis of society, but he describes it in the most abstract, almost fanciful terms, really. He uses the language of, like, it's not exactly, some people say it's like a fable, but it's so abstract and it's like philosophical, so it's not like an historical account. But he is describing like human development there. And he's describing basically the condition of human beings before meaningful civilized life had actually got going. And so when life consisted of a pointed stick and a loincloth, essentially. So this state of nature, or hypothetical life of people before societies emerged, how did it get going? Okay, so then I'm going to move to Kojève now and how he took master-slave, okay? So before I get to what I think Hegel's interpretation was, let's go to Kojève. So in an introduction to the reading of Hegel lectures on the phenomenology of spirit, Raymond Queneau, and Queneau as in not on canoe that you're paddling on one of these, it's Queneau, so my French isn't very good, and Alan Bloom, they got this book together on Kojève lectures of the 1930s on phenomenology. So Kojève lectures I mentioned at the beginning were like very influential on how people read the book. And he says that humans, and this is part of the book, they're not defined as passive spectators, which we would agree with. Contemplation reveals the object, not the subject. The man who is absorbed by the object that he is contemplating can be brought back to himself only by a desire, by the desire to eat, for example. The very being of man, the self-conscious being, presupposes desire. And we talked about that last time, didn't we, about desire. And he's stating what is obviously, Hegel's position. And he thinks, therefore, Kojève, that human reality can only be maintained within a biological reality, biological life. There's no free-floating spirit, if anyone thought Hegel meant that. I don't think he meant it, but he's nailing this down as meaning that it's desire has to emerge from animal life, that, the primitive desire. But it does move people to action, away from contemplation. But if animal desire is not the necessary condition of self-consciousness, because we've moved on from that early stage, haven't we? We're now at self-consciousness. It's the necessary, but it's not the sufficient condition. Let me read that again. But if animal desire is the necessary condition of self-consciousness, it's not the sufficient condition. For self-consciousness to emerge, desire must be directed towards a non-natural object, non-food, non-water, non-drinking. That object, that desire, directed towards is another desire. It's another human. So desire directed towards a natural object is human only to the extent that it's mediated by desire of another directed towards the same object. It is a human desire it is human to desire what others desire because they desire it. Thus, an object. So it's a bit like the love thing, where people fall in love and they love that person, they want them to love them. So thus, an object, and Kojève makes that point. Thus, an object perfectly useless from the biological point of view, such as a medal or an enemy's flag, can be desired because it is the object of others' desires. To be truly human, to be different from the animal, to have moved up, what makes us different, human desire must actually win out over animal desire. So the supreme value for an animal is its own life and its need to preserve that life. Human desire has to win out over this desperate need for preservation. And real humanity only comes to light if the human risks his or her animal life, your animal life, for the sake of this human desire. So if you take any pre-modern tribe, there's like a ritual to do with becoming a member of the community. So sticking your hands in a soldier ant's nest, which can kill you, that's one thing. I think it's a Brazilian tribe. In Vanuatu, young people jump off a tower with a vine attached to their leg, and they try and stop just before the bottom. So there's all these kinds of different initiation ceremonies that people have, which are a risk of life to prove that you can be a member of the human community. You've reached adulthood and you've reached a stage where you can participate. So Kozyev's reading of Hegel, it is jaw-dropping, there's no question. And I do think, again, itself to restate is largely true. I do have some problems with it, which I'm going to come back to the next video. But to continue with this brilliant exposition of the master-slave, to desire the desire of another is to desire the value that I am. Okay, so I'll read this. The desire that generates self-consciousness is finally a function of the desire for recognition. And the risk of life by which the human reality comes to light is a risk for the sake of such a desire. Therefore, to speak of the origin of self-consciousness is necessarily to speak of a fight to the death for recognition. Without this fight to the death for pure prestige, there would never have been a human being on earth. Indeed, the human being is formed only in terms of a desire directed towards another desire. That is, finally, in terms of a desire for recognition. Therefore, human being can be formed only if at least two of these desires confront each other. So, okay, so it's teenagers, isn't it? In gangs, I've seen it in Liverpool, where they bump into each other, they've got hoodies on, and you see that person, you know what their intention is, and you know what your intention is, and immediately, you're not trapped in your ego, because you know what that person's thinking. You know, it's like, you know, they're on a bike, they're cycling through, and they see you. You don't know them, they're on your territory. What do you do? That's the origin of this, that's a way of explaining it to a certain extent, a further way to explain the master-slave and this conflict that comes about, these primitive, these two eyes, these two desires conflicting. So both adversaries in the struggle, though, must remain alive after the fight. So they're going to have a fight, or there's going to be a contest, some fight to the death contest. But, okay, on one occasion, one might kill the other, but then another one turns up. So at some point, when there's a struggle and one of them survives and behaves differently when one doesn't kill the other, Kozyev says, in this nascent state, man is never simply man. He is also either necessarily and essentially a slave or a master. So either you win the fight and you're the master, or you lose it and you become the slave. Because there's no other law. There's no one to come in. By the way, the police aren't there to direct these two people, these two cyclists with hoodies on, cycling through the streets and threatening each other. There's no law. There's just two people with nothing there. Just their desire for self-certainty. Their desire to be all. So the history of society, therefore, can be read as the history of the interaction between mastery and slavery. And the historical dialectic is the dialectic of master-slave. So I've used the word dialectic, I think maybe the first time in this Hegel thing. So this action-centered human begins with the act of imposing himself on the first other, presumably man, that he meets. Then there is a fight to the death, which for Kozyev is a fight for pure prestige, carried on for the sake of recognition by the adversary. So of course recognition is going to be big in Hegel, this idea of the I is that is the we and the we that is the I. So recognition is key. We're going to pick up on this point about, is it a fight for pure prestige? What's the difference? And what is wrong with this particular part of the reading? But anyway, this is the interesting. So the slave is defeated in the battle. He hasn't risked his life. He didn't think it worthwhile, like the master did, to conquer or die. He preferred slavery to death and to remain alive, and he becomes a slave, but usually a he. So the master risked his life, though, for a recognition, but he can't be satisfied only with the recognition. If you remember, according to Kozyev, it's a battle for recognition, for pure prestige. So when he overcomes the other, and he gets the recognition, it can't be from someone who is unworthy of recognizing it. Because the slave for him is just an animal or a thing. And I think in Latin terms, they call slaves mutandus vocalis or something, a talking instrument or something like that. So the slave's just a thing, an object to be told what to do. And to get recognition from that is not going to help the master. And because he's recognized by a thing, the master's desire because the master's desire is directed towards a thing and not towards another human desire. The master therefore gets stuck. Okay, he's won the conflict. It's an initial, it's not a standoff, he's won it. He's subjected the slave. That is a very unstable relationship. It can't really sustain itself. Nevertheless, the institution of slavery is there, maybe the first institution. It's there. And the battle made the master the master. He wants to be a man, according to Kojève's reading, recognised by another man, but can only be recognised by a thing. So it's a bit, I mean, this is a really crap example, but I thought, still thinking, it's like Man City beat like a non-league team 5-0. And the non-league team have got like only 4 players in it. So there's no point if you're so superior to someone, you can't. What's the point in you playing that game if you are so superior? You don't feel any. If the master's saying, the slave's saying, "Yeah, master, you're the greatest thing on earth." Yeah, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? Because you're the slave. So he doesn't get anything from that relationship. Okay, so he's got all his needs granted by the master, and once his needs are satisfied, the other thing is he returns to self-identity. So he says, "Give me a sandwich, slave. Sandwich, eat sandwich, right. Give me a drink." Yeah. So he has these desires. They're satisfied, then he goes back to watching, the box set on telly. He doesn't have any room for development. He returns back to this passive state, which is what mastery is. It's just a state based on desire. It's like an animal state. And he becomes stuck. He can't make progress. His mindset is, or was, I must conquer and become master or die. As Kojève says, he can be killed, the master can be killed, this master mentality, but he can't be transformed. He can't be educated. He's risked his life to be master. Therefore, mastery is the supreme given value for him, beyond which he cannot go. The slave, on the other hand, didn't want to become a slave. He became a slave because he didn't want to risk his life to become a master. The slave, though, is capable of transformation. The slave is given, thousands of years of orders. That's the institution, isn't it? And in the process, build me a castle, to make my food. He does this. In the process, he's doing the building, he's doing the cooking, he's doing the work, he's making nature. He's building these canals, which are actually built by, I think, navvies, Irish navvies, in the 19th century. He's doing all this stuff. And as a consequence of him shaping the world, he masters nature. The slave masters nature. So the slave, this is what Kojève says, in transforming the given world by his work, transcends the given. And what is given by that? Given in himself. Hence, he goes beyond himself. And he also goes beyond the master. So this is the key part, what transforms this. Work, says Kojève, is repressed desire. Work transforms the world and civilizes, educates man. So, repressed desire isn't a bad thing. Repressed desire has helped. I mean, probably many of the navvies who built this canal would have preferred to be sitting off, smoking or drinking or lying back and looking at the sun. They could have done that, but they had to do repressed desire because they'd starve. And it's actually, again, the fear of death. It's the fear of you're going to get sacked and that's the end. You're out and you're going to starve. That, because I think this was built maybe with potato famine or something like that. So these, there's people, if you don't work, they die immediately. There's no welfare state. It's just the end. Work transforms the world, civilizes and educates. So that's Kojève. Slave transforms reality, and he renders the master obsolete. And there's 2 ways to go. The proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie, or alternatively, you end up with some kind of liberal democratic order and democracy. So that is Kojève's idea of master-slave. In a nutshell, truncated, some of it has to be missed out. Hopefully you'll get where he's coming from. And I think the next stage I'll go into a little bit more detail about this master-slave relationship and a bit more about the fight, okay? So I'll see you next week. We'll see whether it's going to be here or not. I might come up with another surprise location or maybe back to the beach. Okay, see you later.